So the topic today is modern architecture. And hey, you need to imagine that when one of these Monday mornings is coming up, I spend the weekend looking at my presentation, thinking, what do I add? What do I subtract? And I have to say up front, this is a pretty inadequate presentation because modern architecture is such a huge topic. And, to give you, a thought about that, I ended up with one Frank Lloyd Wright building in this presentation. And that's wrong, but I have a whole Frank Lloyd Wright presentation that's separate, and maybe that's why it went that way. But so this really is going to be a breezy introduction. I think you all know that my tone is more like a journalist than an academic. I try to make this friendly and approachable. And I just hope this opens up the topic and gives you a good overview so that you feel like you want to go back and use other resources and learn more. Just to reiterate, to get it on screen, what Martha's been saying, we are here usually the first Monday of every month, unless a holiday disrupts. My email's down there if you want to follow up with me and ask questions after the presentations. And absolutely, a used copy of The Shock of the New by Robert Hughes is a good resource for you. And his original programs for the BBC are still available free online. You find them on YouTube or you find them at ubu.com if you want to hear it from the master. So I'm going to start out just the same way that Robert Hughes does. Let's have a little bit of context. If you want to understand modern architecture, if you want to be set up to understand what it is and what it isn't, you have to consider what came before. And Shock of the New begins with the Paris Opera House. And of course, this is a 19th century building, a mid-19th century building, but it really looks like it could have been a palace anywhere in Europe in the 17th or 18th century. It's this grand kind of overloaded, super Baroque style. And I think Robert Hughes calls it a whale of marble and bronze. When he talks about it in the Shock of the New series, he asks a very interesting question. And this was, 40 years ago. If someone had unlimited capital, let's say we had a billionaire come forward to try and make a building like this now, could it even be made? I mean, do we still have enough skilled bronze sculptors and gilders and marble carvers and stone workers? I mean, it really was the last gasp of this kind of stone and masonry handmade building. And it shows you something else, which is that when architects went to school in earlier centuries, in the 18th or the 19th century, the whole skill of architecture was aligned with decoration. And there were whole schools that taught people to decorate civic buildings or royal buildings like this one. So it really is the kind of the dinosaur. It's the last in the line of this kind of great Baroque tradition. And what was happening, earlier, what had been kind of bubbling up was the notion that architecture could be industrialized. And of course, you find new materials being used. This is a very, very significant bridge in Britain. It is an iron bridge that crosses the River Severn. And you notice they even named the village after the bridge once it went up. So it was completed just about the time of the American Revolution. So it was a British architectural triumph at a time they were having trouble in the colonies. And it was the first cast iron arch bridge in the world. And, you may look at it and you may say, well, that's not as picturesque as a stone bridge would have been. Maybe the moss isn't going to grow on it in the same way. But of course, it was, it could be prefabricated. It was lighter. It was much quicker to build, with pilings in the middle. These could begin to cross, greater distances. So there really was a kind of a breakthrough in the use of metal as a new material. The Industrial Revolution was going to drive what happened next in both engineering and architecture. And occasionally, even in the 19th century, architects or engineers found ways to use metal in extremely beautiful ways. And this is a very, very early, I'm going to say, modern or pre-modern building. It actually was designed by an engineer, not an architect. So Henri Labrouste designed this reading room of the Paris Library, 1843. So before the American Civil War. And you can see what metal allowed him to do. It allowed him to have cast iron columns that supported these very, very delicate metal traceries. And they in turn supported glasswork. And what an exquisite and what a forward-looking building this was. I don't think it looks modern to our eyes in terms of the decorative effect, or maybe the recalling of the interiors of religious buildings, but boy, did it use metal in a remarkable new way. And a building that also used metal and glass way ahead of its time was the Crystal Palace, which was made for a great exhibition in Britain in the middle of the 19th century. And one thing you want to think about when you look at this image is you want to know that there were not plate glass factories yet when this building was made. So every single sheet of glass in this kind of palatial greenhouse was hand blown. Acres of glass where, glass makers were blowing out of tubes and then flattening the glass with tongs and making it fit. And I think this building, which was used as an exhibition hall, I'm sure it astonished people, right down to the glass fountain in the foreground. And you can see it was big enough you could have a procession or parade inside. But of course, no heating or air conditioning, lots of leakage, lots of rust. It came down not long after it was erected, but it absolutely is the great-grandfather, the horizontal great-grandfather of glass and metal skyscrapers. As architects and engineers got better in using modern materials and using metal, there began to be this idea that you could build cathedrals in metal and glass. And the Palace of Machines, which was made for the same Paris World's Fair as the Eiffel Tower, really had this feeling of almost a kind of a holy building, the apotheosis of the machine age. And it was filled with steam engines and lathes and metalworking equipment, all of it seen under these kind of giant vaulted skylights. And you must have really felt when you walked through that you were seeing something that would have been thought impossible a century before, this kind of glass palace of the machine age. Here's an interesting fact about the Eiffel Tower, which was made for the same exhibition in 1889, the same Great World's Fair. It was originally built to be temporary. The idea is that it would be taken down along with the rest of the World's Fair. And after a lot of argument, of course, it stayed up and it's become the symbol of Paris. But what a kind of a fantastic achievement. It was the tallest man-made building in the world, tallest man-made structure in the world at the time of the World's Fair. And it gave Parisians en masse a view of the ground from the tower, which was a view very, very few people had seen before, especially if they went on the upper elevator. So unless someone had maybe been in a balloon or at the top of a mountain, they really couldn't have looked down on the modern city and seen what people saw from the top of the Eiffel Tower. So Robert Hughes calls it a pivot in consciousness as a kind of experience. And here's something interesting. I found out about this when I went to Paris. If you do go to the very, very top, there's kind of a miniature wax museum with these wax figures. This is Gustave Eiffel and Thomas Edison meeting at the top of the tower. And that actually did happen. It would be like, I don't know, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates meeting at Apple headquarters now. I don't know if I can think of an analogy, but you can see Edison has his hand on the photograph. And these were the two great progressive, engineering minds of their time having tea at the top of the world's tallest man-made structure. And you can see a beam of the tower coming through. One problem with metal, or it was seen as a problem being used as a new material, is there were complaints that metal was ugly. And certainly there were architects and engineers that tried to work against that. I think some of the more successful attempts came from Hector Guimard, who was also a furniture maker that had the job of designing some subway entrances in Paris. And he really came from the aesthetic of Art Nouveau, to say it better, Art Nouveau, drop the T. And he tried to get the forms of branches and even petals, which he achieved with semi-opaque glass. He tried to bring natural forms into the metalwork and to use castings. So today, when you enter these subway stations, you do get the feeling of a kind of turn-of-century elegance using metal and glass. But the person who really, really worked the hardest to find a hybrid to find a way to use modern materials, but to still refer to and gain inspiration from past architecture, it has to be Antonio Gaudí, the great Spanish architect. And of course, now he's seen as the absolute king, the leader of Spanish Modernism, which you would call their equivalent of Art Nouveau. And I love this quote from the principal of his high school at graduation. He said, "I don't know whether we've given the degree to a genius or a lunatic, and time will give the answer." And of course, I think most people now lean towards genius with just a dose of lunatic, because he had to be crazy to do, in a sense, to do what he did. We're going to find out later in the lecture that a great deal of modern architecture is immensely practical. We're going to go over to Germany and we're going to talk about form follows function. And Gaudí was not buying that. Gaudí was very, very interested in organic forms. He asked his contractors and his builders to do things that were a little bit like the Paris Opera in a different form, almost impossible now, almost impossible when he made them. This fantastic apartment building, the Casa Mila, has these wavering mushroom-like forms on the floors. Each balcony, you see those cast balconies, is a kind of a sculptural ensemble that's unique. There is a roof garden at the top where the fantastic chimneys, appear. And take a look at one of the windows from the Casa Mila. I mean, it's extremely expensive, almost like a kind of a religious architecture that wobbles and moves and glimmers in all kinds of color with stained glass and then reflects the city around it. It's just a statement of just the edge of where architectural fantasy hits the range of architectural possibility. A few details, some of these fantastic, chimneys that look like a knight in armor, the doorway where you'd enter the atrium of the building downstairs, and this wonderful detail of the curved handle of the door of that doorway. So everything was custom, everything was non-standard, every aspect of the building was like a work of art. But if that seems impractical, some of you may have heard of, or if you're very, very lucky, you may have visited Sagrada Familia, the cathedral that Gaudí left plans for. It has been under construction now for more than 140 years. And they had a construction pause during COVID because the revenues were down when tourism was down, but the revenues are coming back up. Tentatively, they were talking about having it done in 2026, and now they've moved that back a couple of years, but maybe our lifetimes, maybe 2030, they're going to complete the final towers of this building. And when you do tour the inside, which is pretty much fully functioning, even though the towers still need to be completed, you just see this incredible lace-like set of details. You see the natural forms of the columns. You see eccentric, uses of architecture that any other engineer wouldn't have tried to attempt. And the story goes that I think Gaudí was a model builder, to make sure if the naves and the roof of this building would hold, he built models and hung weight downs to check how he was able to, support this. And of course, he died before the building was very far along. I think the story goes he was hit by a taxi in the crosswalk, and it took a while before his body was identified because he was not famous at the time. His career was kind of in ebb. But here's a very, very brief video. I think this is under 2 minutes. That will show you a little bit of a view around the building as it now nears completion after 140 years. You know, watching that video, I was having two thoughts, and one thought was, boy, what an outlandish ambition Gaudi had, and how small most of us are in our thinking. And the second thought was, I was going to wager Martha $5 that Mark Daniel Nelson was on Expedia looking at Barcelona fares by the end of that video. You know, we'll find out in chat later, you know, if I'm right about that second thought. But back onto the lecture. You know, here's something I want to put out there. Wait a minute. How could Gaudi be called modern? You know, and think about it. Something that looks like a kind of a crazy Gothic layout, so heavily decorated, nothing simple about it, nothing minimal about it. You know, this extreme, it's really a very conservative statement in many ways. So I think if we ever get to have a wine tasting together, if you do come to Cambria, we can argue about was Gaudi modern or not modern. But I will say he certainly used modern engineering and modern materials, even if his sensibility was very much rooted in the past. Now, this is my wait a minute slide, because it's not architecture, it is modern, but I put this in here to kind of have the presentation take a U-turn. I want to completely change the way you're thinking about this lecture and get you ready for something different. This is the prototype from 1935 and 1936 of the VW Beetle. And if you know a little bit of car history, we'll do car history for a moment. It was Adolf Hitler who actually put out a kind of a prospectus that asked for people to design a car that could hold a family of four, that would get amazing gas mileage, that would be inexpensive, that could be widely manufactured. You know, he was looking at the achievements of Henry Ford, and he wanted a German equivalent, you know, to the Ford company in Germany, which eventually did kind of emerge. And the winner of the design combination was a guy whose name you're going to recognize, a Czech designer named Ferdinand Porsche, who went on to make some very nice cars. But the point of that slide is to say, we need to get back to industrial products, and we need to get back to modern engineering. We need to reset and talk about what was happening for architects and engineers and designers that weren't trying to do things the Gaudi way, that weren't trying to be artists, you know, that were trying to, well, maybe to be a different generation of artists. And especially in Germany, and in other places too, but especially in Germany, there was a growing trend of what you would call rationalism. And I've also heard it called functionalism. And it really is a new kind of ideology. And with this point of view, it's a post-industrial revolution point of view. What about symmetry? What about functionality? What about using geometry and getting rid of decoration? And what about using highly industrialized materials? And that ideology resulted, for example, in 1910, in this, at the time, ultra-modern house, the Steiner House by, by Adolf Loos. And what I wanted to say about it here with the plan is, when you first come across it, when you look at the first photo, it's a pretty simple looking statement from the street, but there's a great deal of planning, great deal of rational planning that went into this house. For example, you can see there in red, half of the roof is flat, and flat roofs were not a thing for private homes before this home. A flat home didn't make sense, but he's put kind of a walking area with rails back. He had a curving roof in front. And when you look at the house from the back, it has 4 distinct levels. And each level of the house was planned so that the level, you know, had its function laid out for it. For example, at the lowest level, you can see that you enter into the garden. And on the first level, we couldn't see it in the photo, but there actually was a garage. You'd pull your car in the garage and you could enter the first level. And then you have the living levels in the 3rd and 4th levels. It was a stucco building. It has a lack of decoration. It looks kind of, you know, modular. The windows look industrial. And inside, you would have found large open spaces that connect with each other and connect with the windows and connect with the outside. And this was in an era when many homes had small, discrete spaces, you know, parlors, libraries that you'd close the door on, or, you know, curtains would close some of the rooms in, say, a Queen Anne house. But here, You begin to see this long modern sofa, oak paneling, exposed oak timbers. It was a very rational kind of a geometric building. In Italy, there was a very, very important architect who died in World War I. He unfortunately died in 1916 at a very young age, the age of 28, but he was an influence through his paper architecture, through his plans for a long time. And that was Antonio Sant'Elia. And he wrote a very, very long manifesto about what he thought architecture of the future should be. And I'm going to read you just a little bit because it gives you the feeling, the passion that he put into it. He proclaimed that futurist architecture is the architecture of calculation, of audacious temerity, and of simplicity. The architecture of reinforced concrete, of steel, glass, cardboard, textile fiber, and all of those substitutes for wood, stone, and brick that enable us to obtain maximum elasticity and lightness. This man's a true believer, isn't he? And in so many ways, he was right about what would be next for architecture. And before he died at the age of 28, he left behind these kind of magnificent schematic drawings that looked a little bit like science fiction when they were made and still new. This one was actually an airport and a train station put together. And there are these kind of long runways. They're cut off by the way I framed this image, but you probably could land your biplane on those long runways, and then you could maybe catch the train to get out to Assisi. But anyways, those are some of his visions. Another one, a city plan from 1914, and you can see it goes underground and then above ground, elevators and towers. Doesn't look too different from what actually did appear 5 or 6 centuries later. But where the skyscraper, since we're heading that direction in the lecture, where the skyscraper really began to appear was Chicago. And something happened in Chicago which changed the history of architecture. And of course, it was the Great Chicago Fire, famously started when a cow kicked a lantern over. Probably all know that song from your grandparents. So something like 3/4 or more of downtown Chicago was destroyed. But people in that city knew that the economy was about to boom, and they put money into rebuilding. And you began to get what you call the curtain wall building. You get a building that is primarily built with metal support, metal beams, metal structure going up that allows you to go multiple stories. Mr. Otis was developing the elevator, which of course these buildings needed. And you call it curtain wall because the windows and the masonry really hang on the metal frame like curtains going down. There was also, I'm going to say, a need for a new type of architecture in Chicago. And this Marshall Field building, which came out at the end of the 19th century, was something new. It was a department store. Now we'd call it a big box store, I guess. But if you look at the Marshall Field store, can you see the way it's actually a 6 or 7 story building, but the floors are framed by these arches? And because the floors are concrete and they're supported by metal, you can build this kind of light structure with great big open floors for the display of merchandise. And then you frame it with masonry arches to make it look at least a little bit classical. And you get a whole new kind of open space for merchandising. Here's another building, a great auditorium building, and not the best photo of it, but when you look at the inside today, which has been restored, you can see that even though these buildings look pretty geometric and pretty boxy on the outside, they did find ways to decorate them, to add lighting, to make them more welcoming on the inside. And of course, decoration. Let's talk about decoration for a minute. Decoration was both a practical and an economic and almost a political issue, because the point of view, especially of the rationalists, especially the Germans and the highly serious European architects, was that decoration was a symbol of the inequality of the past. It was expensive, it was ribbons, it was fluff, it was lace, it wasn't needed. And the new buildings had to be more functional and more affordable. So for example, this Adler and Sullivan building, the Wainwright building in Chicago, it is a very, very rational building with its firm masonry corners and regularly spaced windows, but it has something new. It does have decoration, but the decoration is not hand carved. They didn't bring in stone carvers from Italy. They cast the decoration and fired it in a kiln and then bolted it to the building. And you see that in a lot of 19th and early 20th century buildings. The client wants decoration, but the decoration is factory made. It's kind of a compromise between the old and the new. You see something similar here at another department store designed by Louis Sullivan, who was the mentor of Frank Lloyd Wright, the Carson Perry Scott store, which is still open. Up above, you see this kind of light building with expansive windows, a curtain wall building, but down at the entry, this kind of fantastic Plateresque, almost looks like a 5th century entrance, cast in bronze. So you get the feeling of something ornate and special and spectacular when you walk in, but the heart and soul of the building is modern. Here in Austria, the Secession Gallery in Vienna, and again, you see the architect trying to work out this balance. How do I create something that's dignified and classical and modern, but how do I endow it with a kind of an aristocracy, if you will, that makes it a cultural monument? And you can see the solution they came up with, this kind of fantastic leafy gilded globe at the heart of the building, gives you something to look up at and frames the lettering beneath. But the walls of the building make it really feel in a way like a kind of a mausoleum, like a crypt with no windows. And that's because, of course, in the interior, they were able to have electric lighting to light the paintings. Another development thanks to Thomas Edison. So here's a building that is a real landmark in the history of architecture, and it is by a German architect who was working in Poland, and it is made with a kind of engineering that's really familiar to Southern Californians. It's reinforced concrete, the same structure we find in all our great freeway overpasses. And this building was meant to be a meeting hall that would accommodate a large number of people. And the way Max Berg designed it, he used cable reinforced concrete spanning arches and going in great circles around those arches to skylight the building and create this kind of vast, open, almost gymnasium-like space. And the story goes that after the concrete had been poured, that none of the workers wanted to knock out the supports because they were not confident that this building would stand. And so Max Berg put on his boots and got a sledgehammer and started knocking out the supports himself to show people that it was okay to do it. And eventually the other workers joined him. And of course, you know the end of the story. 120 years or more, the building has been fine and stable. But it was a new, kind of construction that people were insecure about when it first appeared. There's a lot of paper architecture in the early 20th century. And when I say paper architecture, ideas that were impractical but beautiful. Here's one from a German called the Tower of Joy. And of course, after the horrors of World War I, people needed something to be joyful about or to think about in an optimistic way. And you can see this kind of underground city, had it been made, would have had these fantastic knife-edge towers coming out of amber stained glass, all of it supported with huge concrete ribs. And it probably was unbuildable, but wow, does it make a great drawing? And wow, does it make you think expansively about what might be possible in the future? And I guess that was the point. Here's another kind of a proposal. Bruno Taut felt that you actually could maybe trim off the tops of some mountains in the Alps and put these fantastic glass pavilions on the top. It looks a little bit Wizard of Oz to me. It looks a little bit like you'd get the Emerald City. And I know later Frank Lloyd Wright would say you never build on the top of a mountain because then you use the view. He would tell you to build lower down. But there were models of these made, and a couple actual structures were made for world fairs, and they're rather lovely. And again, impractical, never built on a large scale, but it does show you that after the destruction of the war, that architecture offered a space for dreaming at the very least. Now, what was getting built in Germany were, of course, massive factories. And this is the AEG turbine factory designed by Peter Behrens. Peter Behrens gets credit for being an architect slash engineer slash uniform designer. He not only designed this fantastic curtain wall building, but he also designed the logo for the company, which is a big German company, like the German General Electric. And he even designed the uniforms that the workers would wear, and he designed the clocks that were on the wall. All of it rationalist, functionalist, modern, factory made. So again, kind of this cathedral to industry. And then this building by Walter Gropius, who later would come to the United States, the Fagus shoe factory. And I used to have a lot of fun in my classes with groups of students. We could try it in chat if you want to. Can anybody tell me in chat, I'm going to turn on the chat and watch it, what this building did, what feature it had, or what it achieved that had never been done before? There's something absolutely brand new in this building. I'm watching chat to see if anybody gets it. Ticking the clock. The windows, warm, Dina, you're almost there. Corner windows. Barbara, you won the prize, except there's not a prize. Okay, everybody. Okay, Dolores got it, Judy's got it, but that's absolutely right. It is the corner windows, because the corner windows, I mean, such a beautiful thing. It allowed you to show people how light the building was. It's what you call a volumetric building. And you even can see the staircase winding up the front of the building. And then when you are, here we go. Oh, did I lose one? I thought I had an inside view. When you look from the inside out, you can look through the corner of the building onto the, the rest of the factory complex. So that's a museum now, a historic moment in making building, lighter and more rational. Here's another building that didn't get built, but it was very influential. We're going to say that its cousins later did get built. Mies van der Rohe had this idea for a glass skyscraper that would be supported by these massive vertical columns and then floors that radiated outwards in these kind of beautiful round shapes. I love the contrast to the Bavarian style, 3-4 story apartments that are beneath it. And, we could spend an hour talking about the practical problems of this skyscraper if it were built. Number one, where do you go to the bathroom? I'm sure somewhere, but anyways, it was a proposal. It was an idealized vision of what a skyscraper could be. Gropius did a lot to develop prefabrication in building, to talk about ways that you come up with forms and structures and methods that could be used anywhere, initiated in Germany, but built anywhere else. If you're looking around your house right now at your IKEA furniture, thinking, that has something in common with the thinking of Gropius and the Germans of the time, it absolutely does, because modernity was going to be about convenience and affordability and dwellings, for every man. Anti-elitism was a big part of it. Le Corbusier was a Swiss-born architect and designer who came up with a number of concepts that made their way into modern domestic architecture. He had this idea for the domino house. He wanted to entirely open up the floors of houses so there wouldn't be any walls or dividers, just maybe metal columns coming through. You can see he has an exposed staircase, which maybe he borrowed from the Fagus shoe factory or that kind of thinking. And I will say, being in California where we have a lot of earthquakes, I look at that design and think, oh, I hope that's really well built. What happens when the dominoes fall? But again, you can see that inclination to greater space, greater openness, greater connectivity in modern building. A little bit of a sideways here, because as you can see from watching your clock, I'm trying to cover too much too quickly. But let's talk a little bit about skyscrapers. In Chicago, and of course in New York and other eastern cities, the skyscrapers began to compete with each other. Who could make the tallest, the most glamorous skyscraper through the 20s and through the 1930s, all the way to the Empire State Building. I love this Chicago Tribune Tower by Hood because it's another kind of a hybrid building. It's a modern skyscraper to a certain extent, but you go on the roof where they now have luxury condos, and you feel like you're somewhere in medieval Europe. So again, people wanted their decoration and they wanted their history even though many modern architects wanted to erase that. And just a bit of trivia to kind of bring this way forward before we go back to European architecture of the mid-century. The world's tallest building since 2009 is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It's over half a mile tall with 163 floors if you count the maintenance floors. So that's where the competition is at this moment in time. Rationalism, functionalism had a lot of damage that came with it. And if you do walk shotgun the new, you're going to find out that Robert Hughes doesn't care for a lot of modern architecture, and it's kind of fun to hear him slam the ideas. He says this is one of the worst ideas ever. He said that Le Corbusier had an idea for what he called the Boisson plan. And in this plan, they were going to bulldoze most of the center of Paris and put up these modular X-shaped skyscrapers. So everybody would have the same cubicle and the same office, and there'd be a concrete plaza with modern sculpture in the middle, and there'd be gridded roads that come through it. And as Robert Hughes says, thank God it was never built. But Le Corbusier and the other modernist architects, they were still immensely influential. And when you look at the Barcelona pavilion, you're really looking at kind of a showpiece of what could you do if you took functionalism to an extreme, but you used really, really expensive, really beautiful materials. And of course, the answer is you get something that's absolutely exquisite and unlivable. I mean, what do you do with your drink? What do you do with the book you're reading? Where do you put your clothes? I mean, I'm sure there's some closets there somewhere behind the marble and the granite, but there were really very austere ideas about how modern people would live. Le Corbusier updated Peter Behrens in the sense that when you considered his architecture, he would provide you with chaise lounges and sofas, which now you sometimes find in airports. He would design the interiors. He would design the lighting. He wanted a great amount of control over not just the building, but what went into the building. And his essay in modern architecture is the Villa Savoy. And the Villa Savoy, first thing you notice about it is it kind of rises up out of the ground with the columns that he called pilotés. And these pilotés let you know that you're basically in a stucco milk carton. You're in this incredibly light volumetric structure, and half of it is open because Le Corbusier felt, well, you want to play in your roof garden, not on the grass below. You don't let your kids down there because who knows who they might meet. And it's a really, really beautiful structure in a kind of austere way. It frames the landscape around it. It's very minimal. It's very rational. If you like high modernism, there's something kind of breathtaking about the openness and the spareness of the Villa Savoy. And I'm sure somewhere in Malibu, there are a couple of houses that look very much like this with their white stucco, factory-made interiors. And I don't know if I'd really want to rest on that curving tile chaise lounge beside the blue tub. I mean, it looks good. It looks good as sculpture, but I don't know if I'd really be comfortable after my bath reading a book there. He also designed this Unité de Habitation, this fantastic apartment building that's still being used in Marseille. I was looking at Trulia, and you can get a condo there for about 700,000 if this is the way that you like to live. And it was one of the first, urban buildings that had stores in the middle of the building and had a little mall in the center. But as it turns out, French people and maybe Americans too like to get out now and then, and they like to shop on the street. So a lot of the buildings, a lot of the retail part of this has been closed up or has been vacant. Primarily people live there. So I promised you one slide of Frank Lloyd Wright, and he deserves a whole presentation on his own. But I'm going to say that Frank Lloyd Wright really learned from the European architects. He learned from the way they used form. He learned from their rationality. He looked at what's called the international style very, very carefully, but he really believed a building should be beautiful. And he felt that a building should be site specific, that it should really work with what was around it. And he used color and local materials in a much more organic way. So I'm going to say that he both admired but rebelled against what the Europeans were doing. And you see how beautiful that rebellion could be in Falling Water, which of course is just clamped to a rock above this fantastic waterfall that gives it its name. Now, if you're inclined to feel like a college student, you want some takeaway from my lecture today, this is maybe the one slide that you could be your takeaway. Maybe it'll appear on a test someday in your life. But the international style, the style that was kind of codified coming out of Europe, here's what you find in it. I used to joke that the international style comes in three colors: white, white, or possibly white, sometimes with accents in Holland, that you'd see some color. It is a style of volume rather than mass. So you think about the old Baroque piles of the 15th and 16th and 17th century, heavy, heavy walled, stone buildings. Modern architecture tried to show you volume and lightness, lots of flat roofs. Familiar materials to us now, stucco walls and metal frame windows, easily reproduced anywhere. And there were variations on this. In Holland, you got what you call de stijl, the dominant style. And you can see in the Schroeder house that bits of primary colors were locked in to the structure. And what's interesting, and I have to go kind of quickly through this, but I'll put it out there as something you can look into, you really begin to see how architecture and interior design and painting were working together in this era. Because when you look, for example, at that chair by Rietveld, again, it looks like sculpture. If you sat in it, it would be pretty uncomfortable. But when you look at Van Doesburg's University Hall and you look at the ceiling, those of you who paint are probably saying, well, that looks a lot like Mondrian with the primary colors and all of the geometric divisions. And when you look at what Van Doesburg did with the cow in this famous abstraction, he could kind of see, he could look at a cow and he could see buildings and he could see abstract painting. So, the way that Mondrian developed, talking about painting for a moment, this idea of you take the energies and the forms of nature and you observe them. And then you begin to refine them. You begin to simplify them and you begin to look for what is essential and what matters. And then you refine to the point that you just have geometry. That is a kind of a thought progression that appears in modern architecture, and it also appears in modern art. Famously here in a piece that Mondrian did in New York, the Broadway Boogie Woogie, which does look a little bit like a subway map or an aerial map. It's just a kind of a diagram of the energies of the modern city reduced to something that is almost musical. Back to Germany a little bit. Thinking about what developed in Germany, this great emphasis on industrial development, on a kind of an architectural socialism where everything was rational and could be shared by workers, could be part of productivity. Here's a union building he did, a Werkbund from before the war. And this kind of thinking led to one of the most famous schools of art and architecture ever. It led to the Bauhaus, which developed, of course, in the 1930s and is still there in Dessau as a museum. The idea of the Bauhaus was this almost kind of new religious idea about the union of art and architecture, industrial design, engineering, architecture, painting, weaving. It would all be taught in the same school. So that if you were a painter, you would brush up against the architects. If you're an industrial designer, you probably would do some jewelry making. Maybe you would design plates or ceramics. It was all interchangeable. And the idea was there'd be a new kind of high art that would apply to all these things, that would replace the sense of decorative art, what they considered moribund, the art and the traditions of the past. So looking out at the courtyard of the Bauhaus, you get the same view that someone would have gotten looking out of the Fages shoe factory or the Crystal Pavilion. You see metal and glass, you see modularity, and your mind is set to the idea of rational function. And I think you probably can guess what happened to the Bauhaus if you don't know. What happened to its tradition of designs, of industrial produced beautiful objects. And here you see some prototypes. What happened is this, is that Hitler saw the Bauhaus as a Bolshevik conspiracy, shut it down, removed the students, and at least for a while, put an end to that kind of thinking and development in Germany. But that meant that the Germans came mainly to the United States. So throughout the war period, and then especially the post-war period, some of the greatest practitioners and influential architects in the United States were German, like Mies van der Rohe, who worked with Philip Johnson to design this, fiendishly expensive bronze-cornered Seagram building that looks across Park Avenue in New York City. And I think the way that you feel about modern architecture in the end may have to do with how you feel about this kind of building. If you feel like, well, modern architecture gave us, on the downside, the cubicle, buildings that just went tall without doing much else, buildings that separated us from the city. If you're a critic of modern architecture, you probably don't like the Seagram's building. But if you do like purity, if you like structure, if you like geometry, if you like everything in its place, you have to kind of admire the austere and idealistic beauty that was achieved here in this building that never was achieved in pre-war Germany because of the way that history played out. And advertisement for next time. So that was modern architecture. Not that there's not more to talk about, but modern architecture for now. And if you show up on October 3rd, let's go a very different direction and talk about Dali and surrealism. And back to Talking Head to read the chat and see what your questions are.